Die! Die! Why won't you die? Why won't you die?
Beneath this mask, there is more than flesh. Beneath this mask, there is an idea, Mr. Creedy. And ideas are bulletproof.
We do not provide jury trials only for people we find decent. We do not permit society to string up people we find abhorrent without due process of law. Not because we sympathize with this or that defendant, or we sympathize with this or that speaker, but because due process of law is an evolved way of living in a civilized fashion that protects the freedom of all. And defending freedom of speech is defending the freedom to speak out in a way that defends the free speech of all. Perhaps someone else's today, but yours tomorrow.
We are not at our best at this moment. We have turned into a mincing, politically correct leviathan.
You can't say to people, you're too weak to live with freedom. Only that group is strong enough to live with freedom.
I hope that people will start to re-examine some of the dogmas about race that have been unthinkingly repeated for a very long time by people who compliment themselves for being thinking people. The very notion that you would expect groups to be evenly represented is staggering when you realize the tremendous difference in backgrounds from which all groups come. When you realize that cultures tend to endure over a period of time beyond a single generation.
A terrible thing happened today in
Yes.
Paris.
Tell them.
People were killed. Oh, well, I know a lot of people are on vacation, so maybe they don't know what's going on.
You're the host. You got to tell them the bad news.
The bad news is cartoonists, journalists, some other people, police officer were killed in Paris.
This was really big.
It is, yes, especially in our business in particular.
Right.
Especially in your business in particular.
Right. And we have to not avoid who did this. Who did this, Jimmy?
Well, we presume, and I think
No,
it's
it's
safe.
not a presume. No. It's Muslim terrorists.
Yes, Muslim terrorists.
Right. This happens way too frequently. It's like Groundhog Day, except if the groundhog kept getting his head cut off.
Everyone will say, I believe in free speech, but. The problem is everyone has a different but exemption that they would put on free speech. So the issue really becomes who has the power to enforce their exemptions to free speech while keeping absolute free speech for themselves.
And let's also give some credit to this newspaper. This was a satirical newspaper in Paris. These guys had the balls of the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah, their office
Their
was
balls
bombed.
were bigger than Gerard Depardieu. Because they kept doing it.
They were firebombed. Their office was set on
Absolutely.
fire. They continued. The editor said he'd rather die than change his right to free expression.
For the crime of being satirists, for the crime of drawing cartoons. This has to stop.
There is no exemption for hate speech. There are, rightfully, protections against harassment. But if a student followed me around campus all day and stood outside of my office saying, you're wonderful, I love you, you're wonderful, you're brilliant, you're right, that's harassment. That's harassment. If a student who disagrees with me politically says to me, Coors, you're a fascist, that's hateful. I can't imagine anything more hateful. But that student has a right to hold that view of me. Note well that these harassment codes were never applied as written, because if they were, they would not exist for a nanosecond. The first time that a feminist professor, for example, were sent to sensitivity training or given a warning for having offended the males in her class, The first time that a radical professor was sent to Christian sensitivity training because his views had offended the views of Christian students in his class. The cry would be academic freedom. The cry would be, you're not educated unless you've been offended in your beliefs. So these speech codes and these harassment codes depend absolutely for their enforcement upon a double standard. If they were applied equally across the board, they would not last a second. And note very well the signal that that sends to women, to blacks, to gays on a campus, groups which really have struggled to be brought into the circle of the American promise of legal equality. What it says to these groups is, we believe that you are too weak to live with freedom. You're too weak to live with freedom of speech. You're too weak to live with bearing witness in your speech and in your protests against things that you find offensive.
Finally, the notion that the individual or the group is a function of the immediate surroundings is nonsense. I'll give you an example. The Japanese in the United States during World War II, as you know, were interned. They were treated very badly prior to that time. In Brazil, the Japanese were treated much better, and very few of them were interned. In the United States, the Japanese remained steadfastly loyal despite the bad treatment. In Brazil, the Japanese were loyal to Japan right on through to past the end of the war, despite the good treatment. You cannot explain this by what happened in the United States or in Brazil. You can only explain it if you understand that those two groups of Japanese were different before they ever got on the boat in Japan, and that difference persisted in the countries they went to.
I don't think anybody's trying to claim that every migrant going into Europe is going to start raping people. I mean, you had the Charlie Hebdo cover showing that, the 3-year-old boy, Alan Kurdi, who died trying to make it over to Europe, would grow up to become, in their words, a bum groper. But it's a satirical magazine. They do that provocation intentionally. They do it to show how ridiculous something like that is. They're not actually saying that. And nobody's saying that all these migrants are going to come up and be rapists or sexual assaulters or robbers. But what we're saying is we don't know who the people coming into Europe are. There are criminals amongst the migrants. There are terrorists amongst the migrants. We've seen that. We know that to be a fact.
Nowhere in the world do you find this evenness that people use as a norm. And I find it fascinating that they will hold up as a norm something that has never been seen on this planet and regard as an anomaly something that is seen in country after country.
The university would insist that those of us who had been intellectual and cultural and human resources, resident faculty and resident graduate students, now become part of the political correctness police. As universities followed this theory that comfort is the sine qua non of education, it is not, and it is a treating of young adults as helpless infants unable to chart their own way in a world that isn't always neat and comfortable.
Well, there are all sorts of risks to free speech in America, whether they're coming from the progressive left, feminism, Black Lives Matter, on college campuses, the safe space and trigger warning culture. There's a sense in the media in America also that the range of acceptable thoughts and opinions, that they're the ones that you can safely express without risking your newspaper column or risking your career. That's becoming narrower and narrower all the time, and also being shoved quite far to the left. So irrespective of your political positions, my view is that you should want your adversaries to be able to state their arguments in the strongest possible terms, and you should want, if you are confident that you're right and that your facts are right and that your way is the best way, you should believe in an open, free marketplace of ideas.
What a terrible price students are paying now for the idea of comfort. Don't you dare ask for censorship. Indeed, the correct answer to speech you abhor is bearing witness to what you believe.
It isn't radical Islam, it's Islam that is the problem. That is my view. I don't particularly like the way that European cities are changing. I think Germany is a horror show. I think London has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And what happens in America matters for everybody else. What happens in America matters most, and I don't want America to go the same way.
Do you consider yourself a white nationalist?
No.
Isn't that what some people would think of when they hear of you don't like the changing face of places like
No,
London,
I'm talking
you
about
don't like-
culture,
you don't
not
like
race.
Muslims coming in?
No, I'm talking about culture, not race, and it's typical of someone like the BBC to try to conflate the two, because
I'm
what they want to
asking you a
do,
question.
well, what they want to do is to suggest that if you're proud of your country and the ideals on which your country is founded, that somehow makes you a racist. It doesn't. I'm not talking about skin color. I don't care about skin color. All my boyfriends are black. I don't give a toss about skin color. What I do care about is values and ideas, and the regressive social attitudes of Muslims in the West are terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And organizations like yours won't report on them honestly, accurately, or fairly. It's left to other places to do it. And then what you do is, once you've failed to report on them accurately, is accuse people who are concerned with some justification about the changing nature of their culture, not race, in their countries, is you then accuse them of being white nationalists. That's pretty disgusting.
Why would you ever expect that countries that had entirely different histories, located in entirely different climates, different geography, why would you expect those countries to develop exactly the same mix of skills to exactly the same degree?
You're doing it because you want to suggest that there is something nefarious about my belief system. You're doing it because you want to associate my admiration for American ideals, my admiration for what happens in America, and saying that matters everywhere else, freedom, democracy, property, capital. You want to sort of associate that with race. I never did that. You did that.